Hi, this is Richard and Craig with the week 2 feedback video. And Craig, lots of really great comments yet again.
Yeah.
And really a lot of our learners are supporting one another, really sharing their experiences and supporting one another when they're facing challenges, and it's so good to see.
And some very interesting tips and people sharing insights and experiences as well. So learning from each other, not just from what we're putting forward, but that's really great to see, and it's a real sign of a mindful sort of sense of community developing.
So good to see.
Yeah.
We're filming this feedback video a little bit early because of the Easter break, but our mentors will be online over Easter, so please keep commenting and sharing. And
we have a very advanced practice we're recommending this week as well. That's mindful chocolate eating. So if you're going to eat chocolate, eat it with full and undivided attention.
Every mouthful.
That's right.
Yeah. So Craig, this week's got some challenging content in it.
Yeah.
And I guess we should just repeat for our learners that it's very important to go very slowly with these exercises. And, particularly if you're doing some of the meditations or thinking about addressing some of the challenges in relationships, not to start with your worst enemy or somebody who's really going to be overwhelming, but just to perhaps start slowly and think about this like building up the muscles of mindfulness and compassion so that we can gradually apply it to more and more challenging relationships.
You don't step into the gym and just get out the 300-kilo weights and start trying to lift them.
Well, some CrossFitters do, but it doesn't tend to go very well, I don't think. Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
So some interesting things about people being unkind and just the whole issue around bullying and some of the really most uncomfortable relationships we have. And I think there's been some sharing of insights that people are often being unkind to others, often feel terrible in themselves, and indeed it's often the case. In fact, people who are bullying others are as likely to be depressed as the people they're bullying. It doesn't excuse the behaviour.
No, but it does help us to understand it perhaps and have a little bit of compassion.
Yeah, that sort of pain inside often comes out in some very unskillful ways.
Yeah.
And so if we can at least understand that and where it's coming from, it makes it perhaps a little bit easier to be patient and tolerant. But doesn't mean that there isn't perhaps something that needs to be said or appropriate boundaries to draw.
No, so I think mindfulness helps us to have that or have both of them, to explore that relationship between having clear boundaries but also, having compassion for people who might be suffering, and perhaps that's why they're being difficult.
Yes, and, if we really understood where that person's come from or what's been going on in their day and so on, the pressures they've been under, then we might be a little bit more understanding. And that's a very common sign of growing mindfulness, when a person starts to actually realise that the same failings and foibles and everything else that we've got, distraction and worry, etc., coming out in unskillful ways for ourselves, we often see that, and then we actually understand how it is for others.
Yes. Yeah. Now, one of the things that we explored over the last week was the difference between empathy and compassion, and a lot of our learners were talking about that, and it's quite an important distinction, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that there are 3 different types of empathy. There's that cognitive one of understanding someone else's experience. There's intellectually, yeah. There's the emotional one of kind of feeling into their experience. And then that empathic concern, which is really wanting to do something to help, which is much more akin to compassion. And compassion does have that extra step of doing something to help or wanting to help or making wishes that that person not be suffering. And the neuroscience is really interesting, that it activates different parts of the brain to the parts of the brain that are active when we're empathizing.
Yes.
And particularly when we're doing that emotional empathizing, there's that empathic resonance and we're literally feeling the pain of the other person.
Yes. And
too much of that can actually be a bad thing and can burn us out.
Oh, that's right. Especially for carers, and not just carers in their professional life, but carers at home. Especially when we've got sharing a life with somebody who's got their own challenges and problems, that can lead to a kind of carer fatigue or carer burnout.
Yes.
And so learning to feel comfortable in the presence of our own and then others' discomfort is very helpful.
Yeah, just keeping in mind that there's such a thing as empathy burnout perhaps, but not really compassion burnout.
No.
The learners really liked the new meditations as well. They were really well received and different experiences. Yeah.
Yes. Well, and in a sense, I mean, the language and everything is very important around this, but there are nevertheless quite a wide range of experiences, and none of them right or wrong. The correct experience to have is some warm, feeling or whatever, because it might, the practice might hold a mirror up to a discomfort that we have, which will express itself physically, a resentment that's there, for example. Interesting to notice, and this came up in a few different ways, that when wishing care and compassion for and well-being for somebody else, and especially somebody close to us, that it would led to a very positive feeling. But sometimes turning that towards ourselves led to some tears or concern, and that I suppose in a kind of a way it just holds a mirror up to the fact that we're often very critical and judgmental of ourselves, and mindfulness will make us aware of that.
I think it's true, isn't it? And also when we start to practice the opposite, if we practice being gentle or self-compassionate or doing that cultivating kindness meditation, often we start to realize I'm not very kind to myself normally, and that can be very confronting.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually one of the really powerful things about practices like this. It can show us our default habits, as well as giving us an opportunity to start practicing something new. So it's not always a pleasant experience as we bump into that, but it is overall a globally useful, or I guess you'd say beneficial one.
Yeah, the critic just going all the time, and to notice the effect, to be curious about that stuff, not critical of it. Because then we start to criticise the criticism, which gets very complicated.
It's that wall of mirrors, isn't it?
Yeah, not criticism, curiosity. Mm. Mm. And relationships at home as well.
Yeah, a lot of the learners starting to, I guess, communicate more effectively, more mindfully, let's say, and also just to be more aware of the way that they're relating to other people. And of course, noticing the complacency that's often there in our most familiar or intimate relationships. Because, one of those basic qualities of mindfulness is that, or basic fact is that, once we're familiar with some activity, for better or worse, we can do it on automatic pilot, physically going through the motions, thinking about something else.
Yes.
Which is, of course, at times very useful, but has a lot of costs. And when it comes to communication, it's the people that we're most familiar with that we're often sort of least mindful with when we're communicating.
So habituated that we can sort of communicate on automatic pilot, responding to cues without even really noticing. Yeah. I mean, we stop noticing our front door, we stop noticing all the things that are actually
the temperature of the room here. I mean, it's just a natural thing, isn't it?
We stop noticing, and then, of course, for the people who are closest to us. So in a way, we can get most habituated, take most for granted, most assumptions, and we stop really looking or, knowing that person as if for the first time, and that's so easy to happen.
That's right. Yeah. So mindfulness helps us to start noticing that, and also, of course, to start practicing more mindful communication, really listening, noticing non-verbals, not just offering our opinions or waiting for our turn to speak. Yeah. And it also helps us to become aware, as a lot of our learners pointed out, of the need for self-care.
Yes.
Because quite often, particularly if we're caring for somebody and they've got a physical or mental illness, or they're aging or something like that, it's tempting to kind of put their needs ahead of our own. Mm. And if we do that over a period of time, quite often it can lead to burnout or resentment. And when we start to pay attention to that, we start to notice that perhaps putting that oxygen mask on ourselves first is actually an important thing.
Yes, and we have to really distinguish that from selfishness.
Yes.
Where there is a need to respond to somebody, but we say, we're going to do something that's indulgent and ignoring a real need. But the basic self-care, taking time for that, is for ourselves, but it's also for the other person that we're wanting to care for as well. Yeah. And self-care and selfishness, we have to draw that distinction.
One of my favourite things about mindfulness is how it really shows us the interconnectedness between everything, between ourselves and others. And I think once we recognise that, that prevents us perhaps from focusing too much on ourselves or too much on others. And we might get a sense that there's a sort of a systemic sort of thing happening, or that we are connected.
Yeah. It's also been noted that the default mode, so much of it is about black and white thinking in relationships. And I mean, mind you, that kind of thought patterns, it's all or nothing, black and white and so on. These are the kinds of thought patterns that are often behind things like depression.
Absolutely,
It's just, I suppose, the degree and the effect of it. But if we're starting to get an awareness around that, and actually noticing that, it's, our assumptions are this is all bad, that it really does open our eyes to the more nuanced sort of understanding, and also other possibilities that we might be missing as well.
Yes, as well as perhaps noticing that the way that we relate to others is really a reflection often of the way that we relate to ourselves. Yeah. So if we're dismissive, or if we're critical and tough on ourselves, we'll tend to do that with others. And once we start to notice that, perhaps we can recognise the value of changing our relationship with ourselves, using some of the practices in this course, and then having that kind of ripple out and shape the way that we relate to others, which is also really important.
There's been some questions too about what to do when dealing with irrational people. Now, good thing if we can is not to deal with irrational people, but I think we all tend to be irrational to a greater or lesser extent, so we've got to deal with ourselves and deal with others. I think the really important point is that it's not about how others should be. I mean, if we're going to learn and apply mindfulness, we're really working with how can we be, even in the presence of the irrationality, etc. Yes. Can we treat that person with respect? Can we be clear, when, there's reactivity?
Yeah. Taking responsibility for ourselves, perhaps, and our own reactions.
Yes, that's
But
right.
also having boundaries, like we said, and perhaps choosing not to be around certain people.
And in a sense, even when a person might be dragging something down to a lower level, is to stay with our principles of respect and actually listening to the other person's perspective. And very often somebody feels like they've got to raise their voice a lot. Perhaps if there's not listening, you can see that in work environments where there's an escalation, where everybody's talking but nobody's listening. But we have to start with ourselves and treat that person with respect or the care that we would like to be treated with.
Yes.
But certainly no, and maybe sometimes it's not the right time to be having the conversation. Sometimes it's, look, let's just give it a bit of space and walk away and come back and consider it perhaps a little bit later on.
Yeah. So look, we probably better leave it there.
Yes.
But, please keep sharing your experiences, doing the exercises, and keep that conversation going. And have a great break for anyone that's having a break over the Easter period, and we'll see you next week.